right, hello, and welcome to the Grace Hour Show, a Christian program that takes a dive into our daily challenges and helps us learn our faith in a practical way. My name is Liz Robbins, and I'm joined today by my usual co-host, Roger Robbins, and we've got a special guest in the studio. We have Thomas Clark with us today, and we're going to be talking about a really, one of my favorite, I think my top favorite.
Yeah.
Number one topic, which is science and God and how we view those two things. So, yeah, it's gonna be awesome.
And Thomas is coming in from Hungary, where he lives, and he was here in Washington, D.C. to be a speaker at a conference unrelated to this subject. But our subject today that we've asked Thomas to talk about is God is not an equation, and neither is science. Yeah. And we want to try to extract, and we're going to try to, as much as we can.
We're going to squeeze him as much as we can.
Squeeze him as much as we can, and just enjoy the conversation about God and science. So maybe, Thomas, could you kind of give the audience a picture of who you are and what your field of study is and expertise, and then maybe kind of like a little intro to our topic today.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks guys. So I guess the kind of CV part is that So my name's Thomas, and I'm a scientist at the Vigno Research Center for Physics in Budapest, Hungary. I'm a principal investigator on an international project about how we use light and atomic physics to detect magnetic fields. There was a
cool.
No big deal.
So this was something I was quite excited about because it all came across because I was chatted to some guy at a conference, and then we applied for a big bag of money.
What you got?
Yeah. So thankfully, apparently asking for big bags of money does increase your chance of getting big bags of money. Which for the...
You have not, because you've asked not.
Yeah. Which, for those listening, this is not something I can spend on a Ferrari or anything. So this is just money that has to be spent in the lab. But I think it's still exciting because the sort of long-term goal would be to use this ability to detect magnetic fields to distinguish between benign and non-benign cancerous tumors.
Wow.
And so if we get that working, then of course we will be very happy. This is a 3-year project. But that's kind of like a little bit of background on me. My PhD was studying how shaped light interacts with atoms. And particularly, I kind of discovered this effect about how you can change the shape of an atomic shadow without changing the shape of the atom. This was kind of my PhD thesis.
Wow, that was your thesis.
Yeah. So it was
and a discovery. Really.
Yeah. So it was just,
so cool.
This was kind of. Yeah, so partly accidental, partly hitting your head off the wall kind of discovery. So my PhD thesis was Sculpting Shadows was the big title sort of thing.
Wow.
Well, I can say that, so we know you through my father, who I remember when he first started talking to you, he's also a nerd and loves the intersection of faith and science, and talking to you about the nature and qualities of light. And we did an episode, because I think we requested it, about how God is like light, or what we can learn about God in that way. And that was directly due to conversations with you that just I was so excited about, because I love when science can give us like a peek behind the divine curtain a little bit. And I think that is what science does. And so if anybody listened to our past episode on how God is light, that they have Thomas to thank for getting that going.
The inspiration.
He was really the inspiration for that.
Yeah, and so we have to include your wife, Gloria.
Yep.
Yes.
And she's an amazing woman of God, and has a ministry, and then is a professional Christian psychologist, right?
Yeah.
And then also you guys just had the amazing gift of receiving another Thomas Clark in the
Yes, they just had their baby,
Eleanor.
Yeah.
So she
7
came
months,
in your life.
7 months old. So you're starting a new adventure.
Yeah, absolutely.
That all the research in the world can't really prepare you for, Thomas.
Yes, right. You're gonna get a PhD in this, but not yet. So.
Yeah, let's dive in.
Yeah, and really, we want you to kind of just present and give the audience your view, your inside look, because you had mentioned earlier this morning as we sat down, you were talking about how your colleagues are looking into science and the universe, and some look with God, but then others have their back facing God as they look and view science and the universe. Now, you gave us this title, God is not an equation, neither is science. What do you mean by that? And kind of like give us the little foundational elements that help us like kind of grasp that.
So I guess, when I was thinking about it, I think just, first of all, people kind of maybe have this kind of misconception, of what science actually is, that, that somehow... I think it maybe survives almost a kind of Victorian view of what science is that you have this kind of fundamental clock structure, which you kind of wind up and then, let the universe go. And that actually the role of the scientist is simply to observe and to kind of write down what happened. But actually none of this really works anymore. And there are kind of different kind of avenues that I was thinking about when, off the top of my head, I should say it's not like I kind of had any big preparations for this, but there are different avenues. So I would say that, we, as at a relational level, we all kind of, or at least, in the kind of believing world, we understand that God is not just an equation in the sense that, I think, earlier in my life, I kind of had this idea of God, which could really be summed up as like God as the cosmic vending machine. And I think a lot of people wouldn't literally say this, but
rude, but yeah.
but they would act in a way in which this is kind of their model for God, so to speak. It's like, and throughout the wider world, this idea that you put in good deeds, you get good stuff out, and if you put in more good deeds, you get more stuff out. But of course, I don't need to talk to you. This is a podcast called The Grace Hour. So I think there was a understanding that there is such a thing as grace. And so maybe that is not so interesting that, that God is not like that and is not clockwork.
Yeah.
But actually but what I was maybe want to put more emphasis on is that maybe people do think that this is what science is like, but this is also not true. And there are different... I don't know what time we have to talk about these things, but basically I was thinking, so we know now, that physics is not an equation, and we also know now that maths is not an equation. So basically nothing acts like an equation, apart from in a kind of very limited way. And so maybe this is not so well known actually, but it was in the 30s, I guess, that you had guys like David Hilbert, who was a famous mathematician. By famous, I don't mean, the streets of Baltimore. But,
I don't know about that guy, but I believe you.
And he had a big thing where he was like, no, it's not going to be long now. We can know and we will know that maths is consistent and self-describing and powerful, and we no longer need to make any assumptions. And this was his kind of model for maths. And actually, he set up this big program for 30 years, where this was kind of his goal. And there was a conference which was arranged for his retirement, which he then spoke at. And at that conference, he said, he made these statements. It's like we can know and we will know.
Profit.
Yeah.
All profit.
But unfortunately for him, around about the same time at a conference in Austria, there was a guy called Kurt Gödel. And basically what he showed was that both of these things are wrong. So using mathematics, of course it's very difficult to summarize quickly, but But he showed that for any sufficiently powerful mathematical system, it can't describe itself. It will always be based on assumptions, and it will never be possible to show that it's consistent.
Wow. What do you mean based on assumptions?
In the sense that so that if you want to have a system of, let's say, equations which are consistent with one another in the mathematical world, you can only really say that if you prove it. But he actually proved that it's unprovable. Just to be very upsetting for David Hilbert. And that's the thing. And one of the reasons why we know that this was a convincing argument is that because the mathematical community didn't want this to be true, and they fought very hard against this, but have basically accepted it now. And it's actually kind of funny, because if you define a faith, or if you define religion as something which is dependent on faith, then mathematics is the only religion which has proven itself to be a religion.
Wow. That's awesome.
So this is kind of what
they've worked so hard to prove it, haven't they?
Yeah. And so this is kind of what I mean by the idea that so even equations are not equations, sort of thing, in the sense that they require an element of assumption, they require an element of faith, because you can't show that they are consistent.
Wow.
So we had this question to pose then, that what does faith have to do with research? And I feel like that's where we're going with this, right? Like, there is actually not a huge difference between religion and research. Tell us about that.
Or at least, so I think, there are differences, I would say, in a sense, but they're fundamentally not opposites in the sense that, maybe we can get to that part of it, but I think it's it's worth starting off with maybe what we talked about earlier, that they have a lot in common. So even if we just think about what is the definition of a researcher, then a researcher by definition is trying to find things which are new. Either these are things which have never been known before, or that that we just don't understand. But there was nothing which tells you that there are more things to be discovered. You just assume this. You kind of move forward with this assumption that there is more things to be discovered, and moving forward based on an assumption, in a way which changes your behavior, is another way of thinking about what faith is. But actually, it goes a bit further than that, because if you want to be, for instance, a physicist, you have to make very grand assumptions, which most people don't realize. These are assumptions. They just think, that's obvious. Sort of thing.
You were saying this earlier. You were kind of laughing at yourself. You're like, the assumptions I've made, guys.
As a physicist.
And so the assumption that you have to begin, or some of the assumptions that you have to begin with as a physicist, are that, first of all, there are new things to be discovered. That there are things that we don't understand that could be understood. But fundamentally, also, you have to assume that the universe has a fundamental underlying structure.
Yeah.
This is one big assumption. And, and it's not obvious that would be true, and if you compare it to, kind of ancient and Eastern philosophies, that the idea that there is order and pattern in the universe is not something that would necessarily be predicted. But the other assumption is that not just do we assume that there is some underlying pattern, order, structure, etc. in the universe, but that order can be understood by people.
Be known.
Yeah. So it can be known, it can be intelligible.
Those are like two separate and very significant assumptions.
Yeah, exactly. Because, because if your model of what a human is just... like a fish that has got out of hand, then
that's amazing.
Then you wouldn't really, then there's not actually a reason to expect that the universe would be understandable.
Can we put that on a t-shirt though? Like a picture of a human, a fish that has gotten out of hand. That's amazing. That's amazing to think about that.
So why would a fish be able to understand, lunar surface craters? It's like there's not really a fundamental reason to assume that, but somehow humans have this assumption that there is order and that we can understand it. And of course, and the reason now that we believe this is that there's evidence for it, because we have had this history of kind of modern discovery and investigation, and we keep discovering more. So there's no reason to assume that we can't discover more. But but it is worth pointing out that it's like, that this is in itself an interesting discovery.
Yes.
Yeah. I think you were saying that assumption is required for research and for science, really, and you mentioned specifically physics. And I think often people discount faith and religion because it requires assumption.
Yeah.
And we are people of science. We are people of reason. So we're not going to allow ourselves to live off of assumption. So I think this is a really important thing to point out for those listening, whether you're a believer or not, that we live in this postmodern world where people value science and reason very highly, which I'm a big fan of also, love those things. But to disqualify faith in the unseen, saying that it's unknowable, is to also say that you would disqualify the sciences and the search for truth. So I think that's just a great kind of lightning rod, to just put in people's minds that like we live in a world where science is glorified, right? It's like science is king at this point, right? We just follow the science was a favorite motto of recent years. And we say yes and amen to that. Let's do that. But I think it's really cool to recognize that people of faith are not people who have dismissed reason. Yeah. Right.
Maybe some of them are, but
right.
But it's certainly not the case in general. And it's also kind of embarrassing to act as if that's true is one thing without realizing it. But even to say stuff like that is of course pretty ridiculous when you look at like the history of science and where science came from, like the people who were involved.
Tell the people about where science came from, Thomas.
Yeah, so I guess and I kind of I guess why not? So so just to pick up on this point of like it wasn't actually standard in human history to assume that the universe had an underlying order, that it had an underlying structure, or at least not one that was permanent.
Right.
And so particularly in kind of Eastern philosophies, there was this idea that basically the undercurrent of the universe was about warring powers, warring spirits, and had good and bad.
Dualism, right?
Yeah,
right. Yin and yang. Yes.
Yeah, and there is a lot of, in some senses, there is a lot of truth in a dualistic look at things, but usually only when you're looking at it from a certain level of abstraction. So if you just look at your everyday life, then you can. Then you understand the idea that there are good things, there are bad things, and that somehow in a balance you can find a balance. But actually, but the idea that that the universe had a fundamental underlying single structure is something which only really came out of a theistic view of the world, because if you didn't have an overarching single monotheistic agency. Then there was no reason to believe that there was anything to be discovered.
Yeah.
And there was a certain, and this is not just me making it up. It's like there are certain historians of science who point to as a kind of motivating factor. There were lots of things which had to be true at the same time, but a big part of science coming out of sort of Christian Europe was not an accident in that sense, because it was consistent with the underlying worldview.
Yeah.
Whereas the very impressive discoveries, inventions, engineering, etc. that came out of for instance ancient China, they were all impressive in their own right, but they didn't really believe that there was a single unifying structure, and so never found it in this sort of
looked for it.
Yeah, never looked for it, and so
didn't do that research.
And I guess that is a wider point that we know that we perceive. Even in everyday life, we perceive based on what we look for and what we're open to, and it's very
wow.
And there are many sort of famous psychological studies where if you're given a task like counting how many times people pass a ball, then you will completely miss the fact that someone in a gorilla suit walks through the middle of the video.
Wow.
Because you're not
counting
looking for
the passes.
Right.
Yeah.
And so like. So much of our perception, is dependent on what we're open to and what we're looking for. Which is what, again, relates to research and what you're looking for.
So having scientists who had these underlying assumptions that the world has a predictable underlying structure that we would call God, it didn't detract or keep people from making scientific discoveries, but alternatively, it actually encouraged them to discover and understand the universe.
Yeah, I think at a big picture level, this certainly was the case historically, and unfortunately, we learn pieces of history and then kind of extrapolate those pieces, which maybe is a kind of counter argument to this. But you have examples like Galileo, and people are like, oh well, wasn't he kind of persecuted by the church? But actually, it's a much more complicated story because it wasn't actually Galileo. How do I want to say this? Yeah, so the worldview that Galileo was turning over was not the church's worldview, it was really everyone's sort of basic assumptions.
Yeah,
and actually, it was a view of kind of Aristotelian. Is that the way you say that? Sort of science.
Yeah.
And that people didn't want to let go of, a lot of these things. And it's interesting that if you look at it historically, the first people to accept it's actually Copernicus's views were actually the Jesuit priests, because they were the kind of like educational branch of the Catholic Church, and they got what he was saying. And interestingly as well, Galileo wasn't tortured or anything like that. And I'm not defending the fact that he was put under house arrest, but he was put under house arrest because he wrote a book calling the Pope a simpleton. It wasn't because he was but actually his research was actually funded by the Pope. It was a sort of so it was a much more kind of complicated story that he was asked to look into this stuff. He found stuff, and then the Pope only wanted him. And again, I'm not defending the fact that the church was taking such a direct role in this. It was a mistake. But he was actually asked to edit it to be less certain about his discoveries, and he took that quite a bad way. Wrote a book of a dialogue between someone who agreed with him and someone who disagreed with him, where the chief character was called Simplicitus, which was like the Latin for simpleton.
Yeah.
And he just happened to say all of the things that the Pope had said to him as a complete coincidence.
Wow.
No.
Very subtle.
Yeah. He wasn't very subtle. So, but this was like a kind of particular example. But somehow people kind of have latched onto it as a kind of lightning rod for faith is getting in the way of real science. But this is always the fundamental problem is that it's not faith versus something else. It's faith versus faith. There are different types of faith, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you were saying earlier today, you were like, one of my pet peeves is that many people, my colleagues included, and others with different worldviews, take the origins of creation and design and kind of sweep it under the rug. Like, what do you mean by that when it regards to like God as not an equation, and he's not just a clock, but yet here we are faced with the evidence. And for someone like you who kind of like has a seat at the table, you watch it happen. What is that like? And how do you process that?
So it's kind of interesting. So I think it's, I think part of the nature of modern science and, modern research in general is that there are now so many scientists and so much research going on that it's very difficult to maintain a foot in different disciplines. And so to get to a certain level of, academia, you have to focus usually on a narrower and narrower subfield, and so the idea of the kind of Renaissance character doesn't really work anymore because to keep up with your field you have to read hundreds of papers which are all about a very specific topic, and so the kind of conclusion of that, or the kind of extrapolation of that is that actually scientists are very bad philosophers, and that's and it's not so surprising, but it's just because they don't know anything about it.
They don't have the time.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So like, and you find that and it's the same thing with like, celebrity actors telling you how to vote. It's like it's just that they're not, they're very skilled at a particular field, but they don't know anything about this other thing that they're talking about.
Yeah.
But we somehow transfer the power of, in that case, celebrity to some kind of trust. And the problem is that if I'm a physicist, like I don't know anything about bioengineering or anything like that. So like. But somehow, because we group it under the same title, scientist, etc., then we kind of assume that, that my opinion would somehow carry more weight.
I feel like that happens to me, and I don't even have a PhD. I have a bachelor's in biotechnology, and people will defer to me on like medical questions. They'll be like, well, what do you think?
What's this on my skin right here?
I have no idea, So I think that points to just how glorified science has become, because I don't think that that's true of other fields necessarily, but science is like so sacred that people really trust. They have a lot of trust that isn't necessarily earned, but it comes with this idea that science is just it's holy these days. So if you're in the church of science, in the sense that you've studied science, you have some expertise, people really, they listen to you, maybe even more than they should. I think that's often the case.
Yeah, and I think that's, in a way, it's sort of inevitable. You could argue that there's some truth in it, in the sense that, like probably I would find it quicker or easier to understand some neuroscientific fact
than the average person.
Than someone who hasn't studied any science or something.
Yes, for sure.
So there is some overlap, but it's more a question of, actually, have you even looked at the question? Because often, scientists are asked about their opinions and things. Or they're not asked, actually, is more the point. They just give an answer, but about topics which they don't actually know anything about it. It's just, they know of people who are also scientists, and so they naturally trust them more. And, in some cases this is justified, but it's a very dangerous kind of line of reasoning, because it's like, I believe in this because my friend believes in it.
I do think that what science has, or at least for me, studying science and enjoying it and valuing it, and the process, I think, like just the scientific method, for example, of like eliminating variables, like very basic, simple, high school level, where you're learning that there's a way to think about things that is helpful, and eliminating, like understanding something to a point where you can eliminate this effect so that you can look at this one. That type of really rudimentary science is really very helpful, I think, in life. Like when you look at a newspaper article and you're able to kind of look at it critically and say, oh, when they use that statistic, maybe what does that mean? And so I've, in terms of when we look at faith and science, I have valued just that process of thinking, I think, has helped me. And I would just call that reason.
Yeah, we were talking about that earlier, critical thinking.
Yeah.
And it leads me to this question. You're saying God is not an equation, and we see that, like, you're saying through the certain discoveries and more discoveries still to come, but really that like God wants us to be researchers. Like he has designed us that way because God has made himself known. And you were saying earlier, like we were asking this questions, like what does faith and research have in common? Like what are those two? Are they running parallel? And how can they help us? Like in your field, how do you use them? And you said earlier you have assumptions, and you use the word assumptions. And we could maybe translate that as faith in our field.
Yeah, it's like belief.
Yeah. Belief.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, like in the sciences, at its best, what can be different is that you're very clear about what you believe are assumptions and what you believe are facts. Though the facts itself is it's a very tricky thing. But actually, maybe something I wanted to pick up on is just because you talked about this process of critical thinking. And I think this is an extremely powerful tool, and particularly in the form of kind of reductionism. But something which I kind of came across recently, to completely speak outside of my field, like a massive hypocrite, is that so you have this neuroscientist / psychiatrist / literature graduate, Ian McGilchrist, who wrote this amazing work called The Master and His Emissary. And basically this was about the divided brain. And what's interesting about it is that, or one of the many things which is interesting about it, is that basically every animal that has a spine has a brain which is split in two. And, it has some connection under normal circumstances, but it's two separate things. And part of his work was to show that basically all of our previous misconceptions about, previous conceptions about the hemisphere difference were wrong. Because, we had this kind of naive idea that, this part of the brain is for music and this part of the brain is for maths or whatever.
Yeah.
But actually, it's actually much more interesting than that, because what he sort of discovered is that you always, for basically any situation, you use both hemispheres. But the reason why, obviously we don't know what the reason is, but the model which works best at the moment is that the reason we have two hemispheres is because we constantly have a need to look at everything in two different ways at the same time. And so, but they're not equal. Like, they're both important and necessary, but actually we should make sure that things are in their proper place. And just to give you a very crude summary of this, so the left hemisphere of the brain, looks at the same things, but rather than looking at things as a whole, it looks at things as a part. It has this very kind of reductionist, critical thinking approach. It breaks everything down into models. And they were actually able to show that, if you, with pigeons and various things, that if you take a picture of something and cut it up into little pieces and just move all the pieces around, the left hemisphere will still see that as based. Well, the left hemisphere will. It works by looking at everything as a part, but by adding up all of the parts, it will say that, okay, that was a picture of a duck. Whereas the right hemisphere looks at things not as a model but as a whole, and so we'll look at it and see a picture broken into lots of little pieces, and not a duck, that sort of thing. And why I mention this is that to look at the world through a purely critical, kind of rationalistic view is to only use your half of your brain. And I think you can extrapolate that more widely. It's very powerful. But what's also interesting is that the left hemisphere, by nature, doesn't actually know what it doesn't know. Whereas the right hemisphere knows everything that the left hemisphere knows, as well as lots of other things. But because it has so much more information, it can't articulate things as precisely. And this is sort of why you need both parts of the brain. Like, if you want to do something precise, you use the left hemisphere. But the left hemisphere works by ignoring everything which doesn't fit the model.
That's amazing, because I love how you said the model that works best at the moment, fill in the blank. I want to use that more often in my life. Like,
what a humble approach.
That is like a humble approach for sure, as a scientist, but also just even as a person of faith, like that we acknowledge that we are seeking to know God, right? That is our endeavor. I mean, we were mentioning Hebrews 11 in verse 6, and it says that without faith it's impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So that we desire to be people who are seeking after him. We believe that he exists by faith, and then we're like wanting to know him. But we also have to acknowledge that there is so much we don't know. So it's like we want to search and seek and know him. And we can say that the model that works best at the moment,
Yeah.
is what we know of God, what we're able to know. But acknowledging that he's not an equation that we can just
and
add
that's
up.
like the two hemispheres of the brain. Like
Yeah.
you can't
I
just
like
take
that.
one and not use the other.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, so the right hemisphere basically, it does process new, novel things, but the left hemisphere will ignore new things that don't fit the model until it's forced to change by the right hemisphere. And this is why McGilchrist's book is called The Master and His Emissary, because the left hemisphere is very powerful, but should be his emissary and not the master, sort of thing. Because, and I think it's similar with critical thinking, that because you know yourself that, if people only looked at you through a highly critical, reductionistic way, you'd be unlikely to marry them, sort of thing, or something, because there's something missing from that.
Yes.
It's like, you don't.
There's a heart that beats.
Emotions. But
And isn't that what we see so often, even in the sciences? Like, I'm thinking simple, like the way that we understand the human body, and we broke it down into systems, and it's like, oh, there's the nervous system and the digestive system. And actually that's like a really simplistic and inaccurate view of the human body, which doesn't act in these like separate systems. Everything is completely connected and overlapping and interacting constantly. But we have that part of our brain that wants to break things down into its parts because we want to understand. But I think even as scientists, it's like we're always being challenged by the fact that if you do that, you're missing the bigger picture, which is the wonder of the human body, which is a person who has value and isn't just the sum of its parts, like in that way.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, actually, that they did the tests and showed that so basically when you have like kind of like nudgings and feelings and instincts, this is all sort of right hemisphere kind of action. And what they found out was that although it's less precise, it's more reliable in the sense that it's more likely to be true. Because the left hemisphere, because it works based on a constructed model, it will just make stuff up. So it's very unreliable.
Just fills in.
Yeah. So and so they did these tests, for instance, with stroke patients, who had strokes in their right hemisphere, and so were purely functioning on the left hemisphere. That if they asked them, like, you ask them to go to the window, but they sort of forget why they went to the window. And if you ask them, why did you go to the window? They just make stuff up. They said, because I was, it felt dark and I needed more light, or because I was cold and I wanted to heat up. And it's like they've completely forgotten that it's because you asked them to do it.
Yeah.
But they don't, because the left hemisphere doesn't know and doesn't acknowledge what it doesn't know, then it will just make stuff up based on what
it doesn't acknowledge what it doesn't know.
Could
Isn't that like the problem of humanity?
Well,
to not acknowledge what you don't know.
And that's what I was just thinking, like
Wow.
to exclude faith from the research, like how detrimental that is, right?
Yeah. Because you won't discover anything. It's like, it's like, or at least it's very unlikely because, if you, I guess
it's possible we'd make things up too.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, it's so for instance, it's very common, I would say, to make important, so we make important what we can measure rather than measuring what is important necessarily. At least in the sciences.
Wow.
And obviously at its best, and that's the thing, like I'm not...
Let's say that again.
let's-
That was really good. Say that again.
So we make important, what we can measure.
Because that's easier to do.
Rather than trying to measure what's important, because that's hard.
Yeah. Wow. That's really good.
But and that's the thing. Like, I'm obviously as a scientist, I'm not just kind of like dissing scientists, at least not entirely. But
not entirely. No,
but it's it's just
putting us in our place, right? For sure.
Because it's just that you have this fundamental temptation. And actually, if I run with this analogy, to make important what you're good at, and so it's not surprising that scientists, for instance, overvalue IQ and intelligence, etc., because that's kind of what they've been selected for in some level. The same way that an athlete might overvalue sport because that's what they're good at, sort of thing.
Wow.
And so you kind of have to have the whole and maybe just to kind of on the point of the hemispheres, then, the thing, I guess, which fundamentally, makes the right hemisphere happy, if I can put it that way, is actually relationships. And so they find that, so there are certain animals, I think maybe with pigeons as well, maybe squirrels, that if they are worried, because the left eye is controlled by the right hemisphere and the right eye is controlled by the left hemisphere, then you can sort of separate out to some extent which part of the brain is being used. And so if you're looking for something unknown, then you will use a certain eye. Whereas if you're looking at something which you know and want to experience as a whole, then you will use a different eye.
Wow.
And so actually you can also measure the chances that a parent or your mother in particular holds a baby. They will usually hold it with the head on their left side, because they're using their left eye to process the baby with their right hemisphere. Because that's sort of the model, in a sense, or lack of model that it uses, is to look at the baby as a whole, and not because it'd be very unnatural to look at your baby and be looking at like an individual hair
parts.
on their nose or something.
Yeah,
Yes.
you're taking in the baby, the whole baby.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's amazing. I mean, I think we're wrapping up here, but I'm so encouraged because, like you said, we're not dissing science. Obviously, you are an active current scientist, but it's beautiful to see how God has made us to want to know Him and to want to know the universe. Like that, we want to seek out and understand, and that is not something to take for granted, right? That's in that assumption area that we assume that things are even knowable. And it's because God has put that in us. He's put His reason in us. Like the universe is structured. He has placed us in this universe so that we could know Him through that general revelation of like just the incredible creation around us. But it's also like, it's a calling that many people want to ignore, right? Because it's hard and it's not so easily knowable and put into categories. But as people of faith, like we should be encouraged that science is not our enemy. Right?
Yeah, because
that's a
I
big
think
one.
that can cut both ways, in the sense that you can be, kind of blindsided by not being open to new things. But actually, I guess, many, let's say particularly atheist scientists, would accuse, faith-based people of the same thing, of not being open to new ideas, etc.
Yeah.
And so that's it. So it is important that everyone to point out that everyone can fall into that trap of like, well, actually, I know God. God is in this little box that I have constructed, and if He goes outside of that, then I reject
God is
it.
this equation. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah. And we saw that happen. In the, I say
We've
saw. I
seen
wasn't
it.
there,
Yes.
but in the New Testament, so you saw that with the Pharisees. It's like no. According to this line, the way that I interpret it,
Don't heal on the Sabbath.
They pull out the
exactly.
filing
Right?
cabinet. They're like, here you go.
It's like, don't heal on the Sabbath, but then Jesus healed on the Sabbath. And it's like, well, He healed on the Sabbath. That must mean He has divine power. But we believe that God said, don't do anything on the Sabbath. And here we are. And the model that works best at the moment has now been challenged.
Yes.
And that's a good point for those of us who are believers too, that like God will be challenging our model because life challenges us very much so. And I think that's a beautiful thing to think, use both sides of your brain also, spiritually speaking.
Yeah, and what would you say to the audience, just as we close, like to all the researchers out there, all of us, like what would be maybe an encouraging word that would encourage them or motivate them to continue on the journey? What key elements would you say you must use? You mentioned critical thinking. You mentioned not putting God in a box.
Yeah.
What are some...
Anything else to close us out?
Any little keys that would be helpful for us?
So I guess I would say that, fundamentally we are not beings in the sense that we are not kind of static entities that don't change. We are in that sense more like becomings, and so for specifically talking about researchers, then then you move forward with humility that if God is infinite, then there's always more to discover. And so that actually maybe the joy of heaven is that you will every day move more into an understanding of God, but you'll never get to the end, because that's kind of what infinite means.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, it's very discouraging because your job's never finished. But actually, when you look at your view of God through the eye of relationship rather than, as an equation, then you don't want it to end. You don't want to lose your...
That would be boring.
Yeah. It's like, but you never want to stop knowing more about your children or your family or something, and why would that be different with God?
Wow.
That's amazing. Wow. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Thomas. We could keep talking forever, but that's all the time we have for today. So thanks for tuning in, everybody. And don't forget to subscribe so you can stay up to date wherever you watch or listen: YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, and more. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas.
No, my pleasure. Thank you. Mm-hmm.